The year was 1974, and the Smurl family was eager to begin a new chapter in their lives. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their young daughters, Dawn and Heather, were moving into a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They were an ordinary family, working class, looking forward to creating a peaceful life together. Their new home, a duplex, was modest but felt like a fresh start. It was the kind of house where Jack could imagine their kids growing up, safe and sound. Little did they know that it would become the setting for a nightmare that would challenge their understanding of reality. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. Jack had just received a promotion at work, and while the extra responsibilities weighed on him, it also meant more financial security for his growing family. Janet, ever the optimist, had already begun mentally decorating their new home. She saw potential in every corner, every wall, every floorboard. Despite its age and the need for some repairs, she felt hopeful. After all, it was a house they could truly make their own. But from the very beginning, the house felt different. At first, it was nothing overtly alarming, just an uneasy feeling that neither Jack nor Janet could quite shake. The air inside the house always seemed cooler than it should have been, especially in the upstairs rooms. There was a certain heaviness in some areas, like the air was denser, harder to breathe. Janet would sometimes feel as though she was being watched, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Then came the sounds. It started with light scratching noises in the walls. Jack, a practical man, assumed it was mice and set about putting down traps, but nothing ever turned up. The scratching persisted. At night, the family would hear soft whispers, faint but unnerving. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the attic, but when Jack went to check, he found nothing but old insulation and dust. There were no drafts, no wind that could be causing the sounds, and yet the whispers continued. At this point, the family tried to rationalize what was happening. The house was old, so it made sense that there would be creaks and groans. They were still settling in after all. Janet, ever the voice of reason, would reassure herself and the girls that the house was just getting used to them. But deep down, a seed of unease had already been planted. Weeks passed, and the odd occurrences began to escalate. Janet was in the kitchen one afternoon, preparing lunch, when she noticed a dark stain forming on the ceiling above. Her heart sank. Plumbing issues were the last thing they needed. But when Jack came to inspect it, he found that the pipes were fine. The stain, which looked like a deep red blotch, couldn't be explained. Even more disturbingly, it seemed to vanish later that evening, as though it had never been there at all. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a light bulb exploded in the living room. Glass showered the floor, and the family jumped back in shock. Jack cursed under his breath, muttering something about faulty wiring, but when he replaced the bulb, everything seemed normal again. The next day, though, another bulb blew out in the hallway. This time, Janet noticed that the air had grown cold moments before the explosion, sending a chill down her spine. As the incidents piled up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidences. Jack, ever the rational thinker, tried to maintain control of the situation. He busied himself with work, throwing himself into his job to avoid acknowledging the strangeness at home. Janet, on the other hand, began to feel the strain more acutely. She spent more time in the house than anyone else, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her more and more each day. One particularly unsettling night, as Janet lay in bed beside a sleeping Jack, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing outside their bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the girls, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Her daughters were fast asleep in their rooms, and yet the sound of footsteps continued, echoing faintly as though coming from just out of reach. Fear gripped Janet, but she refused to let it consume her. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe just the house settling. But deep down, She knew something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just old. It was something else entirely. And whatever was there, it wasn't friendly. The children, too, began to notice strange things. Dawn, the eldest, mentioned seeing shadows moving in her room at night, though there were no trees or passing cars that could account for them. Heather, still too young to fully understand, complained of bad dreams. She would often wake up crying, saying there was someone in her room watching her. Janet did her best to comfort her daughters, but inside, her anxiety was growing. Jack, still unwilling to fully accept what was happening, brushed off their concerns. He chalked it up to stress from the move, but as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He would come home from work and find the lights flickering, or a door that had been firmly shut would now be wide open. Still, he insisted that they could handle it, that it was all in their heads. But one night, something happened that shattered Jack's skepticism. As he and Janet were watching television in the living room, a foul, rotten stench filled the air. It was so overpowering that it made them gag. Jack leaped up, convinced there was a dead animal trapped somewhere in the house. But after searching every inch of the room, he found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. From that moment on, Jack could no longer deny that something was terribly, horribly wrong with their new home. The once warm promise of a fresh start had been overshadowed by a creeping darkness, something neither of them could explain but both could feel. The house, which had once represented hope and security, was now a source of fear and uncertainty. And as the days passed, the Smurls began to realize that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. It was only just beginning. As the chapter closes, the family's unease is palpable. They are trapped between denial and dread, unwilling to admit what they all now suspect. They were not alone in that house. Something unseen and malevolent had taken root, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. This would be the beginning of their long, harrowing battle against an evil they could neither see nor understand. As the weeks turned into months, the small family's sense of unease morphed into outright fear. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting shadows became impossible to ignore. The malevolent presence in their home was growing stronger, and with it, the intensity of the disturbances. The first sign that things had taken a darker turn came one afternoon when Janet was alone in the house. She had just put Heather down for a nap and was folding laundry in the bedroom when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart quickened. Jack wasn't due home from work for hours, and the children were asleep. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just outside her door. With shaky hands, Janet crept to the hallway, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the hallway was empty, and the air was thick with that now familiar chill. She stood there, frozen, as the footsteps seemed to move through the house. They thudded across the ceiling, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Janet's breath caught in her throat. There was no explanation for it. It felt as though an invisible intruder was making its way through their home, indifferent to her presence, but undeniably there. When Jack came home later that evening, Janet recounted the events, her voice trembling with fear. But Jack, still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation, downplayed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said, though he knew in his heart that this was no ordinary creak or groan of aging wood. That night, the family was jolted awake by a series of violent bangs. It sounded like someone was slamming doors all throughout the house. Jack leaped out of bed, rushing down the hallway to check on the girls. They were huddled together in Dawn's room, their eyes wide with terror. Dawn insisted that she had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed just moments before the noises began. This time, Jack didn't have an answer. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked, but nothing was out of place. The banging had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Janet stood in the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around her, feeling utterly helpless. Whatever was in their home was no longer content with being subtle. It was making its presence known. As the days passed, the activity in the house grew more physical. Objects began to move on their own. It started small. Janet would find the kitchen chairs out of place or the TV remote on the opposite side of the room. But soon, larger items were being tossed around as though by an invisible force. One afternoon, as Janet was preparing dinner, a heavy cabinet door swung open and slammed shut with such force that it cracked the wood. The noise startled her so badly that she dropped the knife she was holding, cutting her hand in the process. Blood dripped onto the countertop as she stood there, frozen in shock. The children, too, were affected. Dawn and Heather would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, insisting they had seen people in their rooms. Dawn spoke of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her around the house, always just out of sight, but unmistakably there. Heather, barely old enough to understand, became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in her room unless someone was with her. Even during the day, the girls were on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or movement. Jack tried to maintain a sense of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He started staying at work later, desperate to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But even at the office, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had latched onto his family. His co-workers noticed a change in him. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion and irritability. It wasn't just the physical disturbances that weighed on them. The emotional toll of living in constant fear was taking its toll. Jack and Janet, who had once been a loving and supportive couple, now found themselves snapping at each other over the smallest things. Tension hung thick in the air, not just from the entity that haunted them, but from the cracks it was creating in their marriage. One night, as Jack sat in the living room trying to distract himself with the evening news, the smell returned, the same foul, rotting stench that had overwhelmed them before. It seeped into the room so suddenly and so intensely that he gagged. He rushed to open a window, but the smell clung to him, making the room feel even more suffocating. Janet, who had been upstairs putting the girls to bed, came downstairs with a look of horror on her face. "It's in their room, Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching them." Jack didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. In the days that followed, things only got worse. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, a deep growling sound filled the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Jack and Janet froze, the girls crying in terror as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It felt as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent force surrounding them, closing in. For the first time, Jack found himself admitting the unthinkable. There was something in their house, something beyond their understanding. The fear that had been gnawing at him for months was now fully realized. They were not imagining things, and this wasn't some harmless poltergeist. This was something darker, more dangerous. Despite his reluctance, Jack agreed to seek outside help. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and the safety of their children was now at stake. Janet had been begging him for weeks to call anyone who could help. She had heard of people who specialized in these kinds of situations, people who had experience dealing with the supernatural. Though Jack still felt a flicker of doubt, he knew they could no longer handle this alone. The day after the growling incident, Jack reached out to a local priest. He was skeptical at first, but willing to listen to their story. The priest agreed to visit their home, offering to perform a blessing in the hopes of dispelling whatever evil was lurking there. But when he arrived, the house seemed to fight back. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The priest, visibly shaken, said prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms. but it did little to calm the atmosphere. That night, the disturbances grew even worse. As the family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickered wildly, plunging them into darkness. A loud crash came from the kitchen, as though all the dishes had been hurled to the floor. Jack ran to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The house was playing with them, tormenting them in ways that defied logic and reason. Janet could no longer hide the deep sense of dread she felt every waking moment. She had always believed in the goodness of the world, but now, faced with the unrelenting terror in their own home, she was starting to lose hope. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate attack on their sanity, their faith, and their family. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls are on the verge of breaking. Jack's skepticism has been shattered, and Janet's resolve is weakening. The paranormal disturbances are no longer random. They are targeted, deliberate, and malicious. The family is trapped in a nightmare they can't escape, and as they stand on the precipice of despair, they know one thing for certain. Whatever is in their house has no intention of leaving. By now, the Smurl family had reached a breaking point. The eerie occurrences that once felt like unsettling background noise to their lives had transformed into a full-fledged assault on their sanity and safety. They could no longer deny what was happening inside their home. Something dark, malicious, and far beyond their control had taken root. With no other options left, Jack and Janet made the difficult decision to seek outside help. They needed answers, and more importantly, they needed a way to reclaim their lives. Janet had heard whispers about a couple who specialized in cases like theirs Ed and Lorraine Warren, well-known paranormal investigators with years of experience. The Warrens had built their reputation by helping families who were dealing with the unexplainable. They weren't just ghost hunters. They were demonologists who had encountered entities far worse than a typical haunting. It was a last-ditch effort, but the Smurls were desperate. They hoped that the Warrens could offer some sort of explanation, or better yet, a solution. The first meeting with Ed and Lorraine Warren was one of cautious hope. The couple arrived at the small residence in the late afternoon, their faces solemn yet kind. They had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that eats away at people's peace of mind, leaving them fragile and unsure. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, could feel the heaviness in the air before she even stepped through the door. She looked at Janet with a mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing full well what might lie ahead. Inside, the house was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Ed wasted no time in setting up his equipment, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and temperature gauges. He wanted to document every possible sign of the paranormal. Lorraine, on the other hand, walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes half closed as she reached out with her mind, trying to connect with whatever presence lingered there. Her expression darkened as she moved from room to room. "There's something here," Lorraine whispered to Janet as they stood in the hallway, her voice barely audible. "It's not just one spirit. I can feel multiple presences, angry, confused, and something much darker. Much worse." Janet's stomach twisted in knots. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just her imagination. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lorraine Warren made it all the more terrifying. Ed approached, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with more than just a haunting here," he said. "There's a demonic entity in this house, possibly more than one. It's feeding off the fear, off the tension in the family." The words sent a chill down Janet's spine. Demonic. She had feared as much, but hearing it spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. Demons weren't just ghosts. They were something far more malevolent, something designed to harm and destroy. The Smurls weren't just dealing with a few bumps in the night. They were facing an active threat, one that had already begun to tear at the fabric of their family. The Warrens explained that such entities often latched onto people, not just places. Demons could be drawn to negativity, emotional pain, conflict, or unresolved trauma. Jack and Janet couldn't help but think back to the struggles they had faced in recent years. Jack's difficult job, Janet's bouts of anxiety, the stress of raising young children. Had the house sensed their vulnerabilities and taken advantage? Ed suggested performing a spiritual cleansing of the home. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would work right away. Sometimes, these entities fought back when threatened, lashing out even more violently. But the Smurls were willing to try anything. The first cleansing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the Warrens advised the family to stay strong and not to give in to fear. That's what it wants, Ed explained. The more you give into it, the more power it gains. Stand together as a family and don't let it divide you. But standing strong was easier said than done. That very night, after the Warrens had left, the activity in the house reached a new level of terror. Jack and Janet were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like furniture had been overturned. Jack rushed to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The dining room table had been flipped on its side, chairs strewn across the floor. Yet there was no sign of anyone, no intruder, no open windows, nothing that could explain the mess. As Jack stood there in disbelief, a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It was low and menacing, vibrating through the walls like an animal stalking its prey. Jack felt a surge of panic, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard anything like it. He backed away, feeling an icy presence behind him, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Upstairs, Janet was trying to comfort the girls, who had been awakened by the noise. Dawn was sobbing, her voice shaking as she told her mother about the dark figure she had seen standing at the foot of her bed again. Heather was too scared to speak, clutching her blanket as though it were her only protection from the malevolent force lurking in the house. The following day, Ed and Lorraine returned to conduct the cleansing. Armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayers, they walked through the house, blessing each room, calling on the entity to leave. Lorraine led the spiritual rites, her voice steady but tense. Janet and Jack followed closely, praying silently, hoping against hope that this would be enough to rid their home of the evil presence. At first, the house seemed to resist. The air grew cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the air, an unmistakable sign of something unholy. The lights flickered violently, and a mirror in the hallway shattered as if struck by an invisible force. The house groaned, as though it was alive and angry, but Lorraine pressed on, her prayers louder, more forceful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house seemed to settle, the oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, Janet felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, she knew that much, but the tension that had been suffocating them had eased, if only for the moment. Ed warned the family that they might not be rid of the entity entirely. Sometimes, these things took time. Demonic forces in particular were known for their persistence. They would retreat, only to return stronger if given the chance. Stay vigilant, Ed told them. This could be just the beginning. For a few days, the house was quiet. Jack and Janet allowed themselves to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the blessing had worked. But just as they began to relax, the activity returned this time with a vengeance. It started with the shadows. Janet noticed them first dark, shifting forms that moved just out of the corner of her eye. No matter where she was in the house, she felt like something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices speaking right next to her. But no matter where she looked, there was no one there. The final straw came one night when Jack was lying in bed, trying to sleep. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though something heavy was sitting on top of him, pinning him down. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to breathe. He tried to call out for Janet, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Jack gasped for air, sitting up in bed. His body trembled, slick with sweat, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Janet had seen enough. Whatever they were facing was beyond anything they could handle on their own. They needed more help, and they needed it fast. The Warrens, though willing to help, knew that they would need to call in reinforcements. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an all-out battle between good and evil, and the Smurls were caught in the crossfire. The question that loomed over them all was simple, yet terrifying. How much more could they endure before the house and whatever was inside it claimed them for good? The Smurl family was trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The spiritual cleansing performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren had offered only a brief respite. Now, the dark presence in their home was more aggressive than ever. Each night brought new terror, and even the daylight hours offered no true peace. Jack and Janet were no longer just afraid. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally worn down by the relentless assault on their family. As the days passed, they found themselves locked in a fight for their survival, both against the entity and against the growing strain on their own relationship. After Jack's terrifying encounter with the unseen force in their bedroom, the family knew they could no longer remain passive. They couldn't wait and hope that the activity would subside on its own. It was clear that the entity had no intention of leaving them in peace. Jack, who had once been the skeptic, was now the most determined to take action. He could no longer stand to see his wife and children suffer. He was determined to protect them, no matter the cost. The first step was reaching out to the church again. The priest who had blessed the house previously had been reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of something demonic. But after hearing about the escalation of the events, he agreed to return. This time, he brought with him another priest who specialized in exorcisms. The word alone sent a chill through Janet. The idea that their situation had grown dire enough to require such measures was horrifying. The two priests arrived one afternoon, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and Bibles. They walked through the house with solemn expressions, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every room. Jack and Janet followed behind them, clutching their children close. Lorraine Warren had warned them that an exorcism was not a simple fix. It wasn't like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations with the demon where everything would be resolved in a single moment. It was a long, grueling process, and sometimes it didn't work the way people hoped. As the priests moved from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, and a sense of unease settled over everyone. The entity was not pleased by their efforts. It was resisting. Janet could feel its presence more acutely than ever. It was as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the middle of the blessing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen, yet there had been no one upstairs. Jack and one of the priests rushed to investigate, only to find that the bedroom mirror had shattered, glass scattered across the floor. The air in the room was thick with the unmistakable stench of sulfur, a sign that the entity was growing more malevolent. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at the broken glass. It was a reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The priests finished the blessing, but their faces betrayed the doubt they felt. The entity had not been driven out, it had only been angered. Janet's hope, which had already been dwindling, now felt crushed beneath the weight of despair. She could see the exhaustion in Jack's eyes. The toll this battle was taking on him. He was doing everything he could to protect their family, but the strain was becoming too much for him to bear. As the days passed, the entity's attacks became more personal. It wasn't just about fear anymore. it was about control. Jack, in particular, seemed to be targeted. He would hear voices whispering in his ear when no one else was around, telling him that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect his family. Objects would move in his presence, as if taunting him, reminding him that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. He began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. Janet watched helplessly as the man she loved slowly unraveled under the pressure. The children were not spared either. Dawn, who had always been the most vocal about seeing shadowy figures in her room, now refused to sleep alone. She was terrified that the entity would come for her, and nothing Jack or Janet said could ease her fear. Heather, who had once been a carefree toddler, was now withdrawn, clinging to her mother's side at all times. The once happy family dynamic had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension and anxiety. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with a movie, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. Jack jumped up, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a low growling sound filled the room. It was the same sound they had heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably evil. Janet's heart raced as she clutched Heather to her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, circling them as if toying with them. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Jack was at his breaking point. He had always been the rational one, the man who could fix things with his hands or his mind. But this was something he couldn't control. It was eating away at him, and he knew that if they didn't find a solution soon, it would destroy them. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of his life and his home. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would fight back. He wouldn't let this entity take everything from him. He began researching ways to defend against demonic forces, reading everything he could find about spiritual protection, exorcisms, and prayer. He reached out to anyone who might be able to help, from religious figures to paranormal experts. He refused to give up, even as the entity continued to wear him down. One of the experts Jack contacted suggested the entity might be using the negative energy in the house to grow stronger. The family's fear, anger, and despair were fueling it, giving it more power. If they wanted to weaken it, they would need to change their approach. Instead of focusing on the fear, they needed to focus on positivity, on love, faith, and unity. It sounded almost impossible, given the circumstances. But Jack and Janet were willing to try anything. They began to make small changes in their daily lives, trying to reclaim their home in any way they could. They prayed together as a family, ate meals together, and spent time doing activities that brought them joy. It wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of their eyes, reminded them of the darkness that still lurked in their home. But they were determined not to let it win. Slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over them for so long began to lift, if only slightly. The entity was still there, still watching, but its power seemed to be weakening. The growling stopped, the violent outbursts became less frequent, and the shadows that had once plagued Dawn's room seemed to retreat. But the fight wasn't over. Jack and Janet knew that they were still vulnerable, and that the entity could strike again at any moment. They had to stay vigilant, to remain strong in the face of the unknown. Their love for each other, their faith, and their determination to protect their children would be their greatest weapons in the battle ahead. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls had begun to reclaim their lives, but the threat of the entity still loomed large. They had learned that the key to survival wasn't just in fighting the darkness. It was in refusing to let it consume them. The Smurl family's ordeal had stretched far beyond what they could have imagined. What began as strange noises and unsettling encounters had spiraled into a nightmare that dominated every part of their lives. They had survived for months, enduring the torment of the dark entity that inhabited their home. Through the help of experts like Ed and Lorraine Warren, priests, and their own resilience, they had managed to hold on. But they knew that the haunting had not ended. The entity, while seemingly weakened, still lingered in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And it was during one of the darkest nights that the final confrontation unfolded. It had been a few weeks since the last major incident, and the family had started to feel a cautious sense of relief. Jack had continued his efforts to keep the negative energy at bay, focusing on family unity and positive reinforcement. Janet, too, had thrown herself into taking care of the girls, finding comfort in the small moments of normalcy they could still cling to. But the entity had merely been lying in wait, its attacks growing less frequent but more intense. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Janet was upstairs, tucking the girls into bed, while Jack sat downstairs in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but his mind refused to shut down. There was always that lingering anxiety, that feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As Janet kissed Dawn and Heather goodnight, she felt a chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, a familiar coldness that sent a wave of dread through her body. She pulled the blankets tighter around the girls, whispering reassurances that she didn't quite believe herself. She told them to sleep tight, that everything would be okay, even though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Downstairs, Jack felt it too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. His heart rate quickened as he set the remote down, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't see anything unusual, but he didn't need to. He knew it was back. Before he could call out to Janet, the lights began to flicker. It started softly at first, a faint buzz as the bulbs dimmed, but within seconds, the flickering became violent, the entire room throbbing in harsh, rapid flashes of light and dark. Jack stood up, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the stairs to get his family. But as soon as he reached the bottom step, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls were shaking, and it was followed by a deep, guttural growl, the same growl that had haunted them before. "Janet!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Janet had already heard the crash, and she was racing down the hallway toward him, her face pale. "The girls!" she gasped, but Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. They had to get the children and leave the house now. But the entity had other plans. Just as Jack reached for the bedroom door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked him back. He stumbled, pulling Janet with him as they both struggled to regain their footing. The door remained closed, though neither of them had touched it. Behind the door, they could hear Dawn and Heather screaming high-pitched, terrified shrieks that made Janet's blood run cold. "Let us in," Janet cried, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jack threw his weight against it, it remained locked, held by some invisible force. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the window illuminated their surroundings, casting long shadows across the floor. The growling returned, louder this time, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was moving toward them from the other end of the hall. Jack's pulse raced. He had never been so scared in his life, but he knew he couldn't give in to fear. The entity thrived on it. He had to stay calm, for Janet, for the girls. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her close, whispering words of reassurance, even though every fiber of his being screamed to run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice, one that sounded neither human nor animal, echoed through the hallway. It was speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but the intent was clear. The entity was taunting them, asserting its control over the house, over their lives. But Jack wasn't about to let it win. "Get out of our house!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. He grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one he had been carrying ever since the Warrens had warned him to keep it close. Holding it high, he began reciting the Lord's Prayer, his voice shaky but determined. Janet, her heart pounding, joined him. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Together, they stood side by side, their voices rising above the growling, the footsteps, the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At first, nothing happened. The entity seemed to grow stronger, the air around them growing thicker, suffocating. But Jack refused to stop. He continued to pray, louder now, as if willing the words to push the darkness back. And then, slowly, the growling began to fade. The footsteps ceased, and the air grew lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted, if only slightly. The door to the girls' room suddenly flew open, and Jack and Janet rushed inside, finding Dawn and Heather huddled together on the bed, shaking and crying but unharmed. Janet scooped them up, holding them tightly, whispering over and over that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was. The entity wasn't gone. They could still feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching them. But for the first time in months, it had backed down. They had stood their ground, and it had retreated. For the next few weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled every room was lighter, and the family began to breathe a little easier. But they knew they weren't safe, not completely. The entity was still there, waiting for its chance to strike again. Jack and Janet took the girls to stay with relatives while they continued to work with the Warrens and the church to find a permanent solution. They couldn't live in fear forever, and they couldn't allow the entity to destroy their family. They had survived the worst of it, but the fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. For families like the Smurls, haunted by forces beyond human understanding, the battle between light and dark was a constant one. But they had learned something important. No matter how strong the darkness seemed, as long as they stood together, it could never fully win. In the end, the Smurl family had endured what many would consider unimaginable. They had faced an evil that most people never encounter, and they had survived. Their story was one of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond that held them together through even the darkest of times. In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling and green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon An agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mountains. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did. A sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Suttonhoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape: the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Suttonhoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary, a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton Hoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton Hoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the king of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity. a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Romang and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwald, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. New Orleans, with its vibrant culture and rich history, has long been a city filled with intrigue. The French Quarter, in particular, stands as a testament to centuries of human experience, both glorious and grim. Amidst the colorful streets and lively jazz clubs, there exists a house unlike any other, the infamous Villari Mansion. Its elegant facade hides a story steeped in tragedy, suffering, and a legacy that has haunted the city for nearly 2 centuries. Madame Delphine Lowry, born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787, grew up in a world of privilege. She was part of New Orleans high society, and from an early age, she understood the importance of appearances. Her beauty, charm, and social standing made her one of the most admired women in the city. She was married 3 times, each union increasing her wealth and status. But it was her 3rd marriage, to Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, that would cement her place in the city's dark history. The couple resided at 1140 Royal Street, a grand mansion in the heart of the French Quarter. The house, with its tall windows, iron lace balconies, and stately appearance, was the perfect setting for Delphine's lavish social gatherings. To the outside world, she was the epitome of refinement, hosting elegant parties that attracted the city's elite. Guests marveled at her grace, her wealth, and the beauty of her home. Yet, behind this polished exterior, something far more sinister was happening within the walls of the mansion. From the early days of her residency, rumors swirled about Madame Lalarie's treatment of those enslaved in her household. While many wealthy families in New Orleans kept enslaved workers, there was something unsettling about the way Delphine interacted with them. Neighbors noticed strange, disturbing incidents, people whispering about how her staff seemed to disappear, never to be seen again. It was said that Madame Laurie had an uncharacteristically cold and distant demeanor towards them, a stark contrast to the warmth she showed her high society peers. One story that circulated involved a young girl who had worked in the house. She had been seen brushing Delphine's hair on the balcony one afternoon. Allegedly, the girl made a mistake, tugging too hard at a tangle. Madame Lalaurie, enraged, chased her through the house and onto the rooftop. The young girl, in her fear, leapt to escape Delphine's wrath, falling to her tragic end. It was an incident that should have triggered public outrage, but instead, it was quietly covered up, thanks to Lalaurie's wealth and influence. Over time, other accounts began to emerge. Some spoke of faint cries coming from the mansion late at night, while others claimed they saw strange figures peering from the windows as if pleading for help. Still, Madame Lalarie's social standing remained intact. Wealth, power, and status allowed her to hide the unspeakable acts that were happening within her home. Dr. Lalaurie, a man of medicine, seemed indifferent to his wife's behavior. Though he was present in the mansion, he often absented himself from the household affairs, spending more time in his practice or indulging in the social privileges of the era. While his presence could have been a moderating influence on his wife, There were rumors that he, too, turned a blind eye to the growing darkness within their home. Madame Lalaurie was careful, ensuring that her public image remained flawless. She continued to host elaborate parties, where the most influential people in New Orleans would gather in her grand ballroom, sipping fine wine, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the sinister reality hidden behind the mansion's closed doors. Yet the cracks in this perfect facade were growing harder to ignore. People began whispering more openly about her cruelty, but it wasn't until a tragic event in 1834 that the full extent of the horror within the mansion would be revealed. An accident in the kitchen, a fire that quickly spread, would bring everything to light. As the fire raged through the lower levels of the mansion, passers-by rushed to help. It was during this chaos that the full truth of Delphine Lalaurie's life came to the surface. The firefighters who responded to the blaze discovered something unimaginable, an attic full of unspeakable suffering. This discovery would forever change the legacy of the Lalaurie mansion. Madame Lalaurie, once admired for her beauty and charm, was now reviled. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of wealth and elegance, would forever be stained by the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The building itself seemed to absorb the cruelty, its once pristine appearance now a reminder of the darkness that lingered there. After the fire, the truth spread rapidly through the city. The socialite, once revered, was now despised. Crowds gathered in outrage outside her mansion, demanding justice for the atrocities discovered within. But before they could take any action, Delphine Lalaurie vanished, slipping away into the night, never to face justice for her actions. She fled New Orleans, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that would forever haunt the city. The Lalaurie mansion, scarred by its history, was left to stand as a reminder of the dark deeds that had taken place within. Over the years, it would be sold and resold, with each new owner finding themselves unable to live comfortably within its walls. The mansion had become something more than just a house. It had become a symbol of the city's most tragic chapter, a place where the echoes of the past continued to linger. The events of April 10, 1834, marked a turning point for the city of New Orleans. A fire broke out in the kitchen of the Grand Lalaurie mansion, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. Neighbors rushed to help, fearing for the safety of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her family. As they approached the house, what began as a simple act of concern quickly spiraled into a moment that would shock the city to its core. The fire, though dangerous, was not the main story. It was what the fire revealed that would leave an indelible scar on the history of New Orleans. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered a locked room on the top floor, an attic that was previously hidden from view. Desperate cries from inside the house led them to force open the door. What they found would horrify even the most hardened among them. The attic was not merely a storage space, but a chamber of unimaginable suffering. Within its dark and claustrophobic walls, a group of enslaved people had been confined, their bodies weakened and scarred from prolonged mistreatment. The air inside the room was thick with the stench of neglect, and the conditions were far worse than anyone could have imagined. Many of them were in a state of malnourishment, with signs of severe physical harm. The most harrowing discovery, however, was the apparatuses and tools that had been used to inflict pain. The evidence of intentional harm was undeniable makeshift restraints, chains, and devices that had no place in a household. It became clear that this was not a result of simple mistreatment, but something far more deliberate and cruel. Witnesses described the scene in hushed tones for years to come. The trauma they encountered was so intense that many struggled to find words to fully capture what they had seen. Those who had previously dismissed rumors about Madame Lalaurie's behavior could no longer turn a blind eye. The truth had been laid bare, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Madame Lalaurie, once a celebrated socialite, had harbored a darker side that had remained hidden for far too long. As the fire raged below, she attempted to maintain her composure, denying any knowledge of the atrocities uncovered in her home. But the evidence was overwhelming, and word spread quickly through the city. The genteel mask that she had worn for years was shattered in an instant. As the news of the discovery reached the streets, a wave of outrage swept through New Orleans. People who had once attended Lalaurie's lavish parties were now among the crowds demanding justice. The story of her cruelty spread like wildfire, and soon a mob gathered outside the mansion, their anger palpable. They called for her to be held accountable, but Madame Lalaurie, ever calculating, managed to flee the scene before she could face the wrath of the public. In the days following the fire, the Lalaurie mansion became a symbol of horror, a place where unspeakable suffering had taken place. It was said that the cries of those who had been harmed could still be heard within its walls, echoing through the now abandoned house. The building itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it had absorbed the pain and anguish that had occurred within. The authorities launched an investigation, but the damage had already been done. The full extent of Madame Lallaurie's actions could never be fully documented, as many of the enslaved people who had suffered under her care did not survive to tell their stories. For those who had been found alive, their recovery would be a long and painful process. The city grappled with the aftermath, struggling to come to terms with the fact that such cruelty had been happening right under their noses. Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, her husband, had been absent during the fire, and there were conflicting reports about his involvement in the horrors that took place in the attic. Some claimed that he was complicit, turning a blind eye to his wife's actions, while others believed he was unaware of the full extent of her cruelty. Regardless of his role, the Lalaurie name was now synonymous with suffering, and both husband and wife vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only speculation about their fates. The city, meanwhile, had to contend with the aftermath. The mansion, now abandoned, stood as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Neighbors avoided the building, unwilling to go near the place that had become a symbol of such intense suffering. It was said that strange noises could be heard at night, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps and cries that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Those who were brave enough to approach the mansion reported an overwhelming feeling of unease, as if the building itself was alive with the memories of what had occurred there. Over time, the Lalaurie mansion became more than just a physical structure. It became a dark legend, a story passed down through generations about the dangers of unchecked cruelty. The people of New Orleans, who had once celebrated the Lalaurie family, now spoke of them only in whispers, as if even mentioning their name might invite some dark force into their lives. For years after the fire, the mansion stood empty, its windows dark and its walls decaying. No one dared to live there, and it became a place of ghost stories and urban legends. People claimed to see figures in the windows, shadows that would disappear when approached, and lights that flickered at night, despite the house being uninhabited. As the years passed, the house became a site of fascination for those interested in the supernatural. Paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and even thrill-seekers flocked to the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghosts that were said to haunt its halls. The house had taken on a life of its own, its dark history forever tied to the legend of Madame Lalaurie. But beneath the ghost stories and the sensational headlines, the true horror of the Lalaurie mansion remained rooted in the very real suffering of those who had been harmed there. Their voices, silenced for so long, were finally being heard, though only through the dark legacy of the building where they had lived and died. The Lalaurie mansion was no longer just a house. It was a testament to the horrors that humans could inflict upon one another. And though Madame Lalaurie had escaped justice in her lifetime, the echoes of her cruelty would continue to reverberate through the city of New Orleans for generations to come. When the Lalaurie mansion fell silent after the events of 1834, the once vibrant home now stood as a monument to human suffering. The horrors unearthed in the attic haunted the streets of New Orleans, and the city's residents grappled with the magnitude of what had occurred behind the mansion's elegant facade. Madame Delphine Lalaurie had vanished into the night, her name forever tarnished, but the scar she left behind remained deep and festering. In the weeks and months that followed the fire, rumors circulated about Madame Lalaurie's fate. Some believed she had fled to France, returning to the homeland of her ancestors to live out the rest of her days in exile. Others speculated that she had assumed a new identity and was hiding somewhere in the American South, far from the public eye. There were even whispers that she had met an untimely end, punished by some divine force for her unspeakable actions. But none of these rumors were ever confirmed. The truth about Delphine Lalaurie's final years remains one of the many mysteries surrounding her legacy. What was certain, however, was the immediate aftermath of the mansion itself. Once the flames were extinguished and the full extent of the suffering within its walls was revealed, the Lalaurie mansion became a place of infamy. The house, with its graceful architecture and prime location on Royal Street, should have been a coveted property, but its dark history cast a long shadow. No one wanted to live there. It was said that the very walls were tainted, that they had absorbed the cries of those who had suffered and could never be cleansed. The mansion stood empty for many years, its windows boarded up and its grand facade slowly deteriorating. Neighbors avoided walking past it, and the building became a source of superstitions. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from within the walls, muffled voices, eerie footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Even in the daylight, the mansion exuded an atmosphere of dread. It was as if the house itself was mourning the lives that had been lost within its walls. Over time, stories of a curse began to take hold. The house, some said, had been cursed by the souls of those who had suffered there. They believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had endured unimaginable pain at the hands of Madame Lalaurie were still trapped within the mansion, unable to find peace. Visitors and passers-by reported seeing shadowy figures in the windows, even though the house was uninhabited. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, as if the spirits were crying out for justice that had never been delivered. As the legend of the curse grew, so did the mansion's reputation as a place of paranormal activity. In a city as steeped in supernatural lore as New Orleans, the Lalaurie mansion quickly became one of its most notorious haunted locations. It was said that those who dared to enter the house would feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a weight pressing down on them as they walked through its dark, empty halls. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Madame Lalaurie herself, still wandering the mansion, forever bound to the place where she had caused so much suffering. Despite the fear that surrounded the mansion, it did not remain abandoned forever. The property changed hands several times over the years, with each new owner hoping to restore the building to its former glory. But no one stayed for long. Each time the house was sold, the new residents would quickly abandon it, citing strange occurrences and an oppressive, unsettling energy that made living there unbearable. Furniture would move on its own, doors would slam shut without warning, and cold spots would appear in rooms that had been warmed by the sun just moments before. The mansion seemed determined to drive away anyone who tried to make it their home. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the late 19th century, when the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman. Hoping to profit from the building's prime location, he turned the mansion into an apartment complex. But almost immediately, tenants began to report strange and disturbing experiences. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in bizarre places. Loud bangs and disembodied voices would wake them in the middle of the night. One tenant even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing at the foot of his bed. Needless to say, the apartment complex was not a success, and the building was once again abandoned. As the years passed, the mansion's reputation continued to grow. Stories of the hauntings attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists alike. Some came hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural, while others were drawn by the dark history of Madame Lowry and the infamous attic where so much suffering had taken place. The mansion had become a macabre tourist attraction, a place where history and legend intertwined to create something both horrifying and fascinating. But beneath the sensational stories of hauntings and curses lay the true tragedy of the Lalaurie mansion, the suffering of those who had been harmed within its walls. Their voices, silenced by history, had been forgotten by many, overshadowed by the legend of the house itself. Yet the presence of their spirits, whether real or imagined, served as a reminder that the true horror of the Lalaurie mansion was not in the ghost stories, but in the very real human cruelty that had taken place there. In the decades after Madame Lallaurie's departure, the mansion became a symbol of the darker aspects of human nature. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, there can be darkness hidden beneath the surface. The curse of the Lalaurie mansion, it seemed, was not just a supernatural affliction, but a reflection of the deep scars left by the cruelty that had been inflicted there. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, the Lalaurie mansion remained a focal point of intrigue and fear. Each new owner, whether skeptical or superstitious, could not escape the house's dark history. The building itself seemed to resist any attempt to erase its past, as if the very stones had absorbed the horror of what had taken place. And so, the legend of the Lalaurie mansion continued to grow, its place in the annals of New Orleans' haunted history cemented forever. Though the mansion still stands today, restored and preserved, it remains shrouded in mystery. Many believe that the spirits of those who suffered there are still trapped within its walls, unable to move on. The building's grand appearance belies the darkness that lingers inside, a reminder that some wounds can never truly heal, and some stories are too tragic to forget. As the years passed and the events of 1834 faded from living memory, the Lalaurie mansion slowly transitioned from a house of horrors to a site of fascination for those drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. New Orleans, a city already known for its deep connection to the supernatural, found in the Lalaurie mansion one of its most infamous landmarks. The mansion's dark history, entwined with tales of tragedy and cruelty, made it a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious visitors from around the world. By the early 20th century, the mansion had changed hands numerous times, with each owner attempting, and inevitably failing, to restore the building to its former grandeur. The house, beautiful though it was, carried an unmistakable aura, an energy that made even the bravest of souls uneasy. Many owners found themselves facing more than just the challenge of restoring a historic property. They faced the mansion's reputation, and for some, the belief that the house was haunted proved to be too much. For decades, people reported strange happenings in and around the mansion. From unexplained noises to mysterious apparitions, the stories that emerged from the Lalaurie mansion seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that the house had never truly been free of its tragic past. Reports of ghostly figures roaming the halls were common, and visitors often claimed to feel a deep, oppressive presence when they entered the house. One of the most frequently reported phenomena was the sighting of a woman believed to be Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. Dressed in a period gown, her figure was said to appear suddenly in various parts of the mansion, sometimes near the grand staircase, other times in the ballroom where she once entertained New Orleans' elite. Her presence, many believed, was not a comforting one. Those who claimed to have seen her often described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were in the presence of someone capable of unspeakable acts. Some visitors even reported feeling an inexplicable coldness whenever they approached the area where her ghost was said to appear. But it wasn't just Madame Lalaurie who was believed to haunt the mansion. Many believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had suffered under her cruel hand were also still trapped within the walls of the house. The attic, where the most horrifying discoveries had been made, was the site of numerous paranormal experiences. Visitors reported hearing faint cries and whispers, as if the spirits of those who had endured so much pain were still calling out for help. Some even claimed to feel invisible hands brushing against them or pulling at their clothing, as though the spirits were trying to make contact with the living. Despite the growing number of paranormal reports, the Lalaurie Mansion continued to attract attention. Its status as one of the most haunted locations in New Orleans only increased its allure. Television shows, books, and documentaries exploring the mansion's dark past and ghostly activity brought even more attention to the already infamous house. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to have recorded strange voices on their equipment, disembodied voices that seemed to cry out in pain or confusion. Others took photographs that showed unexplained shadows or eerie orbs of light hovering in the air. Over time, the Lalaurie Mansion became not just a place where history had been made, but a key location in the folklore of the city. Locals and tourists alike whispered about the house, trading stories of their own eerie encounters or tales they had heard from friends and family. The mansion had become more than just a physical building. It was a living legend, a place where the boundary between the past and the present, between the living and the dead, seemed to blur. For many, the mansion represented the darker side of New Orleans history. While the city was known for its vibrant culture, music, and festivals, the Lalaurie Mansion was a reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold dark secrets. The house, with its elegant architecture and prime location in the French Quarter, was a symbol of the extremes of wealth and power that had once defined New Orleans society. Yet beneath its beauty lay a history of cruelty, one that could never be fully erased. As paranormal activity around the mansion grew more notorious, so did the house's reputation as a dangerous place. Visitors who entered the mansion often described feelings of nausea, dizziness, or overwhelming sadness. Some even claimed that the mansion had a malevolent energy, that the spirits within were not simply restless, but angry, perhaps vengeful. Over the years, more extreme accounts emerged. People reported being physically harmed while inside the house, scratches appearing on their arms or legs, or even being shoved by unseen forces. These incidents only added to the legend of the mansion, making it seem like a place where the past continued to assert its power over the present. By the mid-20th century, the Lalaurie Mansion had become a fixture in New Orleans ghost tours. Guides would lead groups past the house, recounting its grisly history and the terrifying encounters that had taken place within. For many tourists, the Lalaurie Mansion was the highlight of their trip, an opportunity to get as close as possible to one of the most haunted locations in America. The house became an essential stop for anyone interested in the supernatural, and its dark reputation only grew with time. Yet for all the stories of hauntings and ghosts, there was also a deeper legacy at play. The Lalaurie Mansion, with its history of suffering, forced the city to confront a part of its past that was often overlooked. The cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people who lived and worked in the mansion was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker history that had shaped New Orleans and the American South. The house, haunted though it may be, stood as a reminder of the human cost of greed, cruelty, and unchecked power. In recent years, the mansion has once again been restored, with new owners taking great care to preserve its historical significance. Yet despite the renovations, the aura of the house remains unchanged. Visitors continue to report strange occurrences, and the mansion's reputation as a haunted house remains as strong as ever. For many, the Lalaurie Mansion will always be more than just a historic building. It will remain a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the spirits of those who suffered continue to make their presence known. Whether the Lalaurie mansion is truly haunted or whether its reputation is the result of centuries of storytelling and fear, one thing is certain: the legacy of the house is deeply intertwined with the history of New Orleans. It is a place where the weight of the past is felt in every corner, where the walls seem to whisper of forgotten tragedies, and where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the fog that often rolls in from the Mississippi River. In the 21st century, the Lalaurie Mansion stands as a paradox, a symbol of both history and legend, fact and myth, beauty and horror. The world may have moved on from the events of 1834, but the mansion itself remains a physical embodiment of those dark days, forever linked to its infamous past. Despite the modern renovations and the shifting landscape of New Orleans, the mansion continues to capture the public's imagination like few other places in America. Today, the Lalaurie Mansion is not just a historical landmark. It has become a cornerstone of popular culture, a setting for numerous films, television shows, and books, all exploring the darker corners of the human psyche. Whether portrayed in dramas, thrillers, or supernatural tales, the mansion's story is retold time and time again, each version adding a new layer to its already complex mythology. One of the most notable examples of this is its inclusion in American horror stories, where the mansion's history is fictionalized and reimagined for modern audiences, though always with an air of eerie realism that echoes the true horrors of its past. The fascination with the Lalaurie Mansion extends far beyond the borders of New Orleans. Ghost tours and paranormal investigations have been featured in documentaries and online content, drawing viewers who are captivated by the idea of a real-life haunted house. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to the city, eager to catch a glimpse of the place where history and the supernatural intertwine. Standing in front of the mansion's elegant facade, it's easy to forget that behind those walls, untold pain once occurred. And that's exactly what makes it so enticing for those intrigued by the macabre. For some, the Lalaurie Mansion is more than just a tourist attraction. It's a portal into the mysteries of the afterlife. Paranormal investigators have spent years documenting their findings, hoping to provide proof of what so many have claimed to experience firsthand. Some investigators enter the mansion armed with cutting-edge technology, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and voice recorders designed to capture sounds inaudible to the human ear. What they find often defies explanation. Shadows dart across empty rooms. Temperatures drop inexplicably, and strange, disembodied voices are captured on audio. Some investigators have even reported feeling physically touched by unseen hands, reinforcing the belief that the mansion is more than just haunted. It's alive with an otherworldly energy. Despite the numerous investigations, there has never been definitive proof that the mansion is haunted. Skeptics argue that the stories surrounding the house are nothing more than folklore, exaggerated by decades of retellings and the city's love for ghost stories. But for every skeptic, there is someone who has experienced something unexplainable, something that suggests that the mansion's dark. History has left an indelible mark on the present. One of the most perplexing mysteries surrounding the Lalaurie Mansion is the fate of Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. While the general consensus is that she fled New Orleans after the fire, her exact whereabouts after her escape remains shrouded in mystery. Some believe she fled to France, living out her final years in anonymity, while others claim she never left Louisiana at all. There are even rumors that she returned to New Orleans in secret, blending into the city's society under a false identity. Although many have searched for definitive answers, none have been found, leaving her ultimate fate one of the mansion's most enduring mysteries. As for the mansion itself, its future seems just as uncertain as its past. Despite its renovations and modern use, there remains an undeniable sense that the house is still tied to the past, as though it cannot escape the horrors that once occurred within its walls. Those who live near the mansion often report strange happenings, lights flickering in the windows, unexplained sounds late at night, and an unsettling feeling that they are being watched. Even after all these years, the mansion continues to captivate and terrify in equal measure. The people of New Orleans, long accustomed to the city's rich tapestry of supernatural tales, often treat the Lalaurie mansion with a mixture of reverence and fear. For some, it's simply part of the city's history, a tragic chapter that reflects the darker aspects of humanity. For others, it's a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and cruelty. And for many, it's a place to avoid altogether, a site too steeped in sorrow and suffering to be approached lightly. Yet for all the terror associated with the mansion, it has also become a place of reflection. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the true victims of the Lalaurie mansion, the enslaved men, women, and children who suffered at the hands of Madame Lalaurie. Their stories, long overshadowed by the legend of the mansion itself, are slowly being brought to the forefront. Exhibits and historical tours now make a concerted effort to honor the lives that were lost and to tell the fuller, more nuanced story of the mansion's past. In many ways, the Lalaurie mansion has come to represent the complexity of New Orleans itself, a city where beauty and tragedy often go hand in hand, and where the weight of history is felt in every corner. The mansion, with its grand architecture and dark legacy, stands as a testament to the city's resilience, but also as a reminder of the cruelty and suffering that once lurked behind its closed doors. It is both a symbol of the horrors of the past and a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting history. Even as the mansion continues to evolve, whether as a private residence, a tourist destination, or a historical landmark, it remains a place of unanswered questions. Is it truly haunted? Will the spirits that are said to inhabit its halls ever find peace? And will the true story of Madame Lalaurie's life and crimes ever be fully uncovered? The Lalaurie mansion, with its dark past and uncertain future, stands at the intersection of history and myth, a place where the lines between the living and the dead are forever blurred. And as long as it remains standing, it will continue to fascinate, terrify, and captivate those who dare to look beyond its elegant exterior and confront the chilling truths that lie within. The mansion's tale, though centuries old, is far from over. As new generations discover the story of Madame Lalaurie and her house of horrors, the legend will continue to grow, ensuring that the Lalaurie mansion remains one of the most haunting and mysterious locations in all of New Orleans, a place where the past never truly dies, and where the echoes of its dark history continue to reverberate through time. In the dense, shadowy forests of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, the legend of the Jersey Devil was born. The year was 1735, and whispers of dark occurrences spread through the tight-knit, superstitious communities that called this untamed wilderness home. The origins of the tale began with a woman known as Mother Leeds, whose story was destined to be recounted and altered over generations, evolving into the chilling myth that persists to this day. Mother Leeds was no stranger to hardship. She lived in the remote Pine Barrens, where life was harsh and the land unforgiving. She and her husband, Daniel Leeds, struggled to support their large family. With 12 children already filling their modest home, the thought of yet another mouth to feed filled Mother Leeds with dread. Some versions of the story depict her as an exhausted and frustrated woman who could no longer bear the burden of raising such a large family under desperate circumstances. As the legend goes, Mother Leeds discovered she was pregnant with her 13th child and, in a moment of frustration, uttered words that would come to haunt her. Let this one be a devil. It was not uncommon for people in that time to curse their misfortunes, but her words seemed to carry an ominous weight. Soon after, strange occurrences began to plague the Leeds household, as if the land itself were reacting to the spoken curse. The wind howled through the trees with an unsettling wail, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Months passed, and as her pregnancy progressed, Mother Leeds was filled with a sense of dread she could not shake. On a stormy night, she went into labor, with the roar of thunder echoing through the forests and the wind rattling the walls of the modest cabin. She was attended by midwives, who came despite their own fears of venturing into the dark woods during such tempestuous weather. As they gathered around, the labor seemed to drag on far longer than usual, as if something unnatural was at work. When the child was finally born, it seemed at first to be a healthy, ordinary baby. Relief filled the room, and the midwives began their usual tasks. However, as moments passed, that relief quickly turned into terror. The newborn began to change before their eyes, its cries growing louder and more guttural. Its small body elongated, limbs stretching and contorting unnaturally. Thin, bat-like wings sprouted from its back, and coarse hair emerged along its skin. The creature's eyes glowed with a fiery intensity as its face twisted into a grotesque, animalistic form with a snout and jagged teeth. It was as though some dark force had possessed the child, transforming it into a creature that defied all understanding. Panic gripped the midwives, who recoiled in horror as the creature let out an inhuman shriek and took flight, bursting through the cabin's roof and disappearing into the night. The legend claims it escaped into the depths of the Pine Barrens, leaving a trail of shattered timber and broken shingles behind. As the howling winds faded, the house fell silent, except for the terrified cries of Mother Leeds, whose life had been forever altered by that cursed night. In the days that followed, stories about the events in the Leeds household spread quickly through the local villages. Some whispered that the baby was indeed born with a curse, while others believed that Mother Leeds had dabbled in dark practices, invoking powers beyond her control. There were those who said she had made a pact with forces unseen, an unholy bargain for a reason that remained a mystery. Rumors also circulated that the Leeds family was associated with other forms of local superstition and dissent, adding fuel to the fire. As the tale spread, the child's transformation into the Jersey Devil became more elaborate, with each retelling layering new details onto the existing lore. The local religious community viewed this story as a warning against sinful behavior and moral decay. They saw the events as divine retribution for what they believed was Mother Leeds' blasphemous curse. The Pine Barrens, with its vast, dark forests and twisting trails, became a breeding ground for superstition. People whispered that the woods themselves had a life of their own, and that Mother Leeds' cursed child roamed them as a creature of vengeance or punishment. Farmers and travelers claimed to hear strange cries at night, and there were occasional reports of livestock disappearing or being found with bizarre injuries. The Leeds family name, once associated with the influential and sometimes controversial almanac writer Daniel Leeds, grew darker with each passing year as the story of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with the family's own complicated history. Daniel Leeds himself was no stranger to controversy. His writings had been condemned as heretical by some religious leaders, leading to suspicions that his family had fallen under some kind of supernatural influence. Thus, the tale of the Jersey Devil was not merely a ghost story, but also a reflection of the fears and conflicts of the time. The story would continue to evolve, becoming a part of local folklore and an emblem of the mysterious Pine Barrens. With each generation, new elements were added. The creature was said to have cloven hooves, a serpent-like tail, and the ability to breathe fire. Some stories suggested it could vanish into thin air, or that it appeared as a foreboding omen before disasters. The legend became ingrained in the culture of New Jersey, passed down from parents to children as a cautionary tale. In this way, the Jersey Devil became more than just a myth. It was a symbol of the dark unknown, the fears that lurked on the edges of society, and the potential consequences of words spoken in anger. As time went on, the details of its origins were debated, but the essence of the story persisted. A child, cursed from birth, transformed into a creature that roamed the Pine Barrens, leaving behind a legacy that would be told and retold for centuries. Mother Leeds' tale was just the beginning. What had started as a night of terror in a small, rural cabin would grow into one of America's most enduring legends, forever haunting the dark woods of New Jersey. The legend of the Jersey Devil, rooted in the terrifying events surrounding Mother Leeds, began to spread far beyond the Leeds household, becoming a tale that seeped into the very fabric of life in southern New Jersey. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sightings of a strange creature in the Pine Barrens grew in frequency, captivating the imaginations and fears of the people living in the area. These early reports varied widely, but they all carried one consistent theme. There was something unnatural dwelling in the dense, dark woods. The Pine Barrens itself, a sprawling forest of nearly 1 million acres, was an environment that seemed tailor-made for legends. It was a place of winding trails, boggy marshes, and trees so thick that sunlight struggled to penetrate. The forest had long been viewed with suspicion by settlers, who saw it as a wild, untamed land. Even the Native American tribes, such as the Lenape, spoke of spirits in the woods, though their lore did not describe anything quite like the Jersey Devil. The stories that emerged in the wake of Mother Leeds' fateful night added a new layer of dread to a place already shrouded in mystery. The first recorded sightings of the creature began to appear not long after the legend's origin. These early accounts spoke of a flying beast with wings and a hideous, animal-like face. Witnesses often described seeing the creature during moonless nights, when the sky was black and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Farmers reported strange tracks near their properties, hoofprints unlike those of any known animal, and some claimed to have lost livestock under mysterious circumstances. Their remains discovered with peculiar marks and no signs of a struggle. The sightings were not limited to rural farms. They occurred near towns as well. People spoke of encountering the creature along lonely roads, its figure emerging from the darkness to spread its wings and take flight, disappearing into the night sky with a bone-chilling screech. The descriptions varied in detail, but shared enough similarities to keep the legend alive. Some spoke of the creature as being the size of a large dog, while others insisted it was much larger, with a wingspan that stretched 10 feet or more. Its face, they said, was ghastly, a twisted mix of horse-like features and something else, something more sinister. As these accounts circulated, the Jersey Devil became a symbol of the unknown dangers lurking in the Pine Barrens. The early settlers, already living in a land that felt wild and unpredictable, found a new reason to fear the woods at night. It wasn't long before the Jersey Devil began to take on a near-mythical status, with sightings spreading beyond the immediate area and becoming known in neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Delaware. Each new report seemed to add to the creature's lore, with the details morphing and expanding as the story spread from mouth to mouth. The local communities, largely isolated and deeply rooted in superstition, embraced the tale with a mix of fear and fascination. The Jersey Devil was not just a tale of a monstrous beast. It was a reflection of the people's anxieties, a manifestation of their unease with the harsh wilderness and the difficult lives they led. The creature came to represent the unpredictability of nature, a symbol of the forces that lay just beyond human understanding. Religious leaders sometimes used the legend to illustrate sermons, presenting the Jersey Devil as a sign of the devil's work or as a warning against moral decay. The narrative of the creature's origins, involving a cursed child and a mother's desperate words, played into the idea of divine punishment, a notion that resonated in the deeply religious communities of the time. As stories continued to circulate, some were written down, further cementing the Jersey Devil's place in folklore. Newspaper articles from as early as the late 18th century referenced the creature, Although these accounts often carried a tone of skepticism, treating the sightings as curious local tales rather than serious events. Still, enough people reported seeing the creature or claimed to know someone who had that the legend persisted. In fact, the mystery surrounding the Jersey Devil seemed only to deepen with each new account. The Pine Barrens' reputation grew darker, and the people living near its borders took additional precautions, especially at night. Among the most unsettling reports were those from hunters and woodsmen, people who spent much of their time in the forests and were familiar with the local wildlife. These men spoke of encountering something that defied explanation, a beast whose movements were unnatural and whose presence sent chills down their spines. Some told of hearing strange cries echoing through the trees, a sound that could not be attributed to any known animal. A few claimed to have glimpsed the creature up close, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness before it vanished, leaving them shaken and bewildered. The legend began to attract more attention from those outside the region, including skeptics and scholars. While some dismissed the stories as mere superstition or the exaggerations of frightened minds, others were intrigued by the consistency in the descriptions. Cryptozoologists, though not yet a recognized field at the time, would have considered the accounts with great interest, noting how folklore could sometimes hint at unknown species or animals not yet classified by science. It was suggested that the Jersey Devil might be a misidentified species, an animal unknown to the scientific community, or even a creature brought over from another continent during the age of exploration. However, for the locals who lived near the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil was not simply a curiosity, it was a very real part of their lives. They took its presence seriously, sometimes avoiding certain areas at night and sharing stories of encounters to warn others. Families passed down tales of the creature from generation to generation, each new version adding details or altering the story slightly, but always keeping the core of the legend alive. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories of the beast that roamed the woods, and young men dared each other to go deep into the forest to see if they could catch a glimpse of the infamous Jersey Devil. The early sightings of the Jersey Devil did more than just entertain or frighten. They helped shape the identity of the Pine Barrens and the people who lived there. The legend offered a sense of continuity in a world that was rapidly changing, with new settlers arriving and industrialization slowly encroaching on the once untamed wilderness. In some ways, the Jersey Devil served as a guardian of the old ways, a reminder that despite humanity's attempts to tame the world, there would always be mysteries beyond our control. It was a story that belonged to the land itself, a legend that grew from the soil of the Pine Barrens and took root in the hearts and minds of those who called it home. As more people came to believe in the Jersey Devil, sightings continued to be reported, often with a sense of dread and wonder. The stories became a fundamental part of the region's folklore, blending the line between myth and reality. What had started as a rural legend was now something more, a shared cultural experience that unified the communities of southern New Jersey, giving them a tale as old and deep as the woods themselves. The legend of the Jersey Devil might have lingered on the fringes of folklore for centuries, but in January 1909, it exploded into the national consciousness. The events of that week, often referred to as the Week of Terror, would solidify the Jersey Devil's reputation as more than just a rural ghost story. It became a phenomenon that captivated newspapers, terrified communities, and left many wondering whether the Pine Barrens really hid something monstrous in its depths. It all began on a cold winter night when a report surfaced from Bristol, Pennsylvania, just across the Delaware River from New Jersey. A man named James Sackville described hearing an unusual noise outside his window, something between a high-pitched scream and a growl. When he looked out into the darkness, he caught a glimpse of a creature like nothing he had ever seen before. A large, winged beast with glowing eyes and a horse-like face. Sackville's report quickly spread, and soon others were coming forward with similar stories. Some described seeing strange tracks in the snow hoof-like prints with an inexplicable stride, indicating that whatever made them had either jumped an impossible distance or taken flight. Within days, reports were coming in from various towns across New Jersey, Philadelphia, and even as far away as Delaware. The newspapers picked up the stories, and sensational headlines screamed about the Jersey Devil's return. Eyewitness accounts described the creature swooping down from rooftops, darting through backyards, and even scratching at doors and windows. People reported livestock disappearing, dogs barking furiously at nothing, and unsettling noises in the dead of night. It seemed as though the entire region was in the grip of some unseen force, and no one felt safe. One of the most widely circulated accounts came from the towns of Haddonfield and Killingswood, New Jersey, where groups of people claimed to have seen the creature firsthand. In Killingswood, it was said to have attacked a trolley car, terrorizing the passengers before vanishing into the night. Witnesses described it as having leathery wings and a long tail, its eyes burning red as it screeched and flapped away. In Haddonfield, a local pastor reportedly saw it perched on the roof of his church, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Though he attempted to get closer, the creature flew off before he could confirm what he had seen. The panic reached its peak when schools closed due to widespread fears, and workers stayed home rather than risk encountering the mysterious beast. The New Jersey police and the local fire departments were flooded with calls. Armed search parties were organized to venture into the Pine Barrens, equipped with rifles and torches. Despite their best efforts, none could find any definitive trace of the Jersey Devil. No lair, no nests, and no captured beast. The only signs of its passage were the peculiar tracks that continued to appear in fields and on rooftops, and occasional, spine-chilling cries that echoed through the night. The 1909 panic also saw a rise in reported close encounters that stretched credulity. For example, one story told of a local woman who claimed to have fended off the creature with a broomstick after it supposedly landed on her roof. Another account came from Camden, New Jersey, where it was said that a police officer fired his revolver at the creature without causing it any harm. In these stories, the Jersey Devil seemed almost supernatural, as if it could not be harmed or captured, a being that defied not only nature, but also the laws of physics. As the panic gripped the region, explanations for the sightings varied wildly. Some people theorized that the creature was a kind of prehistoric animal that had somehow survived extinction. Others suggested it was a mutant born from the swamps of the Pine Barrens, where harsh conditions and isolation might have bred some unknown species. A few more imaginative individuals even suggested it was the vengeful spirit of a long-forgotten Native American shaman, wandering the woods in search of those who had wronged his people. However, the most popular explanation continued to be the traditional folklore surrounding Mother Leeds and her cursed 13th child, who had been transformed into the monstrous Jersey Devil. Skeptics, however, were not so quick to believe. While some of the more sensationalist newspapers ran wild with the stories, others attempted to provide rational explanations for the strange events. They speculated that the sightings were the result of mass hysteria, a kind of collective panic that spread from person to person, inflaming imaginations and leading to exaggerated claims. Some believed that known animals, such as owls or large birds, were being misidentified in the dark, their natural behaviors mistaken for something far more sinister. The peculiar tracks, they suggested, could have been the work of pranksters looking to capitalize on the frenzy. Still, for every skeptic's voice, there seemed to be 2 or 3 believers, each with their own story or testimony. Many of these accounts came from individuals who had no previous interest in the legend and no reason to fabricate such tales. The consistency in descriptions, wings, hoof feet, glowing eyes, and a horse-like face was difficult to dismiss entirely. Even the most level-headed members of the community were left with a lingering doubt. a fear that perhaps there was some truth to the ancient story that had haunted New Jersey for so long. The events of 1909 left a lasting impact on the region. Though no solid evidence was ever found to confirm the existence of the Jersey Devil, the legend was more alive than ever. It had made the leap from local folklore to national attention, capturing the imaginations of people far beyond the Pine Barrens. The panic also left behind a legacy of bizarre folklore and unexplained events. For years afterward, occasional sightings continued to trickle in, often dismissed by authorities, but never completely forgotten by the people. The story of the 1909 Jersey Devil panic has been revisited by historians, folklorists, and cryptozoologists alike. Some researchers have suggested that the surge in sightings could be tied to the socio-political climate of the time, with economic uncertainty and societal changes contributing to the spread of fear. Others have noted that the mass sightings corresponded with a time of significant cultural interest in the supernatural and the unusual, a period when ghost stories, seance practices, and interest in the paranormal were particularly popular in American society. In retrospect, the 1909 panic serves as a fascinating case study in the power of folklore and mass psychology. It demonstrates how stories can take on a life of their own, fueled by fear and imagination. Even without tangible proof, the legend of the Jersey Devil persisted, each retelling a new report adding to the mystery. The events of that fateful January were not just a momentary spectacle. They were a defining chapter in the ongoing tale of the Jersey Devil, forever cementing its place in American folklore. Though the mass hysteria eventually subsided, the question remained: what did people really see? Was there truly a creature lurking in the Pine Barrens, or had the legend simply grown so strong that it could compel people to see what was not there? The answers may never be known, but one thing was certain: the Jersey Devil had become more than just a local legend. It had emerged from the shadows to claim its place in the American imagination, a story that, for one chaotic week in 1909, seemed all too real. After the infamous events of 1909, the legend of the Jersey Devil didn't fade away. It evolved, adapting to changing times and finding a place in the hearts and minds of new generations. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, sightings and encounters continued, adding fresh layers to the lore and keeping the mystery alive. Each account shared enough elements with the original tales to maintain continuity, but the details varied as the Jersey Devil took on new forms in the public's imagination. The Pine Barrens, with its eerie landscapes and isolated expanses, remained a fitting backdrop for modern encounters. In the years following the 1909 panic, the region saw periods of renewed interest whenever a fresh sighting was reported. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the creature flying over the treetops, its dark wings silhouetted against the sky, while others spoke of hearing unsettling sounds that seemed to come from deep within the forest. These accounts often came from local hunters, hikers, or drivers who found themselves in the more remote areas. The Pine Barrens, despite its occasional bursts of tourism, retained a sense of foreboding that seemed to invite such stories. One well-known sighting occurred in 1937, when a taxi driver in Salem City reported an encounter with the Jersey Devil. While driving late at night along a rural road, he described seeing a winged creature dart out in front of his vehicle. According to the driver, the beast's eyes glowed in his headlights, and it let out a high-pitched screech before disappearing into the darkness. His account gained some local attention, with skeptics suggesting he had mistaken an owl or largebat for something more sinister. Still, those who were familiar with the legend found his story compelling, as the description matched the creature's classic features: wings, glowing eyes, and an unnatural cry. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Jersey Devil once again captured public interest. During this era, America's fascination with the strange and unexplained reached new heights, fueled by a cultural interest in UFOs, cryptids, and supernatural phenomena. The Pine Barrens, with its long-standing association with the unknown, became a focus for those interested in such mysteries. Reports emerged of the creature being seen near campgrounds, darting across highways, and even peering into cabin windows late at night. Some visitors to the region claimed to have found odd tracks or heard chilling cries echoing through the forest. The most notable incident of the modern era took place in 1972, when an off-duty police officer in the town of Atco claimed to have come face-to-face with the Jersey Devil. According to the officer, he was driving home late one evening when he saw a creature standing on the side of the road. Its appearance was otherworldly, a horse-like face with glowing red eyes, leathery wings, and a long tail. As he slowed down, the creature suddenly leaped across the road in a single bound, disappearing into the thick forest on the other side. The officer's story was widely circulated, and while it attracted a fair share of skepticism, his reputation as a credible witness added a degree of legitimacy to the account. In the decades that followed, reports of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with local culture, appearing in everything from tourist attractions to sports teams' mascots. The New Jersey hockey team, the Jersey Devils, adopted the creature's name in 1982, cementing the legend as a proud, albeit spooky, part of the state's identity. The story continued to serve as a symbol of the Pine Barrens' mystery and allure, often used as a promotional tool to attract visitors to the area. Festivals, haunted tours, and themed events kept the legend alive, drawing in enthusiasts who were eager to explore the history behind the myth and perhaps even catch a glimpse of the infamous creature themselves. Despite the commercialization of the Jersey Devil, genuine sightings continued to be reported. In 1993, a park ranger in the Wharton State Forest, one of the largest protected areas of the Pine Barrens, claimed to have heard an unnatural wailing sound late at night. The ranger, who was patrolling the forest's more remote trails, said the noise was unlike anything he had ever encountered, even in an area known for its diverse wildlife. The sound, he described, was half scream, half growl, and seemed to come from a place deeper in the woods. Although he never saw the creature that night, the experience left him uneasy, and he made sure to include it in his report. In the 21st century, as technology advanced, sightings of the Jersey Devil began to shift into the realm of social media and digital forms. People shared stories, photos, and videos, claiming to have seen strange creatures in the woods or captured mysterious sounds on audio recordings. While many of these modern accounts were met with skepticism, often dismissed as hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity, the persistent nature of the reports suggested that the legend still had a powerful hold on the public's imagination. Skeptics pointed to the influence of media, the availability of digital editing tools, and the desire for attention as reasons for the increase in reports. However, for some, the similarities between older accounts and new stories raised questions about whether there was still an element of truth behind the legend. The Jersey Devil's role in popular culture has also evolved, appearing in films, television shows, and books. It has been portrayed as everything from a menacing monster to a misunderstood creature struggling for survival in a world that encroaches on its territory. Each depiction adds another layer to the legend, blurring the lines between fact, fiction, and folklore. While some versions stick closely to the traditional accounts of a cursed creature from colonial times, others take creative liberties, reimagining the Jersey Devil as a guardian of the Pine Barrens or a symbol of environmental preservation. These modern interpretations reflect changing attitudes toward nature and the unknown, demonstrating how folklore can adapt to contemporary themes. The Pine Barrens itself, despite becoming more accessible over the years, retains an air of mystery that fuels the legend. Even today, much of the area remains wild and uninhabited, with miles of dense forests, wetlands, and abandoned towns. For those who venture into its depths, the feeling of isolation can be overwhelming, as if stepping back in time to an era when the land was truly untamed. It is easy to see how stories of strange creatures could persist in a place where reality and myth seem to coexist. For many, the Pine Barrens is not just a physical location, but a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blur, allowing legends like the Jersey Devil to endure. As new sightings continue to be reported, it remains unclear whether they are simply the product of overactive imaginations, deliberate fabrications, or genuine encounters with something unexplainable. Some researchers continue to investigate the phenomenon, exploring whether the Jersey Devil could be linked to undiscovered species, rare animal mutations, or even psychological effects of the Pine Barrens' unique environment. Others remain convinced that the legend is a cultural artifact, a story that has persisted because it speaks to deeper human fears and the allure of the mysterious. Regardless of its origins, the Jersey Devil remains an iconic part of New Jersey's folklore. It is a reminder that even in an age dominated by science and technology, there are still places where the unexplained can thrive, where stories can become more than just tales told around a campfire. The legend of the Jersey Devil is not merely about a creature lurking in the woods. It is about the enduring power of folklore, the mystery of the Pine Barrens, and the way stories can shape the world around us. As the legend moves further into the digital age, its ability to adapt and endure suggests that the Jersey Devil will continue to haunt the Pine Barrens and the imaginations of those who hear its tale. It is a story that refuses to die, a legend that lives on in the shadowy depths of New Jersey's forests, where even the skeptics may find themselves glancing over their shoulders, just in case. As the legend of the Jersey Devil evolved over the centuries, it became more than just a tale of a creature stalking the Pine Barrens. It emerged as a cultural touchstone that reflected the fears, hopes, and mystery of the region. While modern sightings and stories have added new dimensions to the folklore, the pursuit of truth behind the legend continues. Whether through scholarly research, amateur investigations, or creative reimaginings, the Jersey Devil endures as a powerful symbol of the unknown. In recent decades, various researchers and folklorists have revisited the Jersey Devil legend, seeking to separate fact from fiction. Some have taken an academic approach, exploring the story's historical and cultural origins. They have traced the tale back to colonial times, examining the context in which the legend first emerged. In a time when superstition and religious beliefs heavily influenced daily life, the birth of a devil in a remote area could have served as a cautionary tale about curses or the consequences of going against social norms. Scholars have noted how the Jersey Devil legend may have originated from fears surrounding the natural world, unexplained phenomena, or even as an early form of propaganda to discredit local families or rival settlements. One theory suggests that the original Jersey Devil story was a form of political satire. According to this interpretation, the Leeds family, who were associated with the legend, had a history of conflict with prominent figures in early colonial America. Daniel Leeds, a member of the family, was a well-known Quaker turned Anglican who published almanacs that included astrological symbols and other content considered controversial by the Quaker community. His son, Titan Leeds, later continued the family's publishing business and had a famous feud with Benjamin Franklin, who humorously predicted Titan's death in his own almanac. Some folklorists have proposed that the Leeds family was transformed into the infamous Leeds Devil as a way to mock them or cast aspersions on their character, especially given the family's outsider status in the Quaker-dominated region. As historical research sheds light on the legend's origins, other investigators have focused on the possibility of a real creature behind the sightings. Some cryptozoologists, a group of researchers dedicated to studying unknown animals, have suggested that reports of the Jersey devil could stem from sightings of an undiscovered species native to the Pine Barrens. They argue that the creature's described features, such as its wings, unusual cries, and peculiar tracks, could be attributed to a large bird or a species of bat not yet documented by science. While the likelihood of such a discovery remains slim, the Pine Barrens' unique environment, with its dense forests and isolated areas, continues to fuel speculation about the existence of hidden wildlife. Another scientific approach has considered the psychological and sociological factors that may explain the persistence of the Jersey Devil legend. Researchers have pointed to the role of mass hysteria, particularly during times of economic or social stress, as a possible explanation for clusters of sightings. For instance, the 1909 panic occurred during a period of industrialization and economic uncertainty in the region, which may have heightened people's fears and made them more susceptible to believing in supernatural occurrences. The human brain's tendency to seek patterns and explanations for the unexplainable could have played a role in turning ordinary events or animal encounters into seemingly paranormal experiences. In addition to academic and scientific efforts, the Jersey Devil has attracted a devoted community of enthusiasts who continue to search for evidence of its existence. Equipped with modern technology, these amateur investigators venture into the Pine Barrens armed with night vision cameras, audio recording equipment, and drones. They document unexplained sounds, strange tracks, and occasionally claim to have captured brief glimpses of shadowy figures. While these investigations have yet to yield definitive proof, the thrill of the hunt and the possibility of uncovering the truth keep the legend alive. The Pine Barrens itself, with its rugged terrain and haunting atmosphere, only adds to the allure of these expeditions. The Jersey Devil has also left a significant impact on local culture, influencing the way people perceive the Pine Barrens and even New Jersey itself. The legend has become a symbol of state pride, embodying the resilience and mystery of a place often overshadowed by its urban reputation. The story has been incorporated into school curriculums, local festivals, and even marketing campaigns, all of which celebrate the state's unique folklore. Many residents see the legend as a reminder of New Jersey's diverse heritage, where history, nature, and myth intersect. Tourism related to the Jersey Devil has grown in popularity, with guided tours, themed attractions, and merchandise contributing to a local industry centered on the legend. The Pine Barrens has become a destination for ghost hunters, nature enthusiasts, and those simply curious about the mysterious creature. However, the commercialization of the legend has led some to question whether the true essence of the folklore is being lost in the pursuit of profit. While the stories continue to attract visitors, some traditionalists worry that the deeper meaning behind the legend, its roots in local history, and the interplay between humanity and nature may be overshadowed by sensationalism. The role of the Jersey Devil in media has further complicated its legacy. The creature has appeared in various forms of entertainment, from horror movies and TV shows to comic books and video games. Each portrayal adds a new twist to the story, sometimes transforming the Jersey Devil from a frightening monster into a misunderstood anti-hero or even a victim of circumstance. These creative retellings highlight the legend's adaptability, demonstrating how folklore can evolve to suit contemporary audiences. At the same time, they can blur the line between the original story and modern interpretations, making it difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. For those who live near or frequently visit the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil remains an ever-present element of the local landscape. Even among skeptics, the legend is acknowledged with a sense of respect, if only for its place in the region's history. Residents sometimes share stories passed down through generations, often in a tone that mixes humor with an underlying hint of unease. While many don't truly believe in the existence of the Jersey Devil, there's still a quiet recognition that the Pine Barrens can be an eerie place, especially at night. The dense forest, the remote trails, and the sounds of unseen wildlife create an atmosphere where the legend feels almost plausible. As the Jersey Devil legend continues to grow, it serves as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling. The creature's tale has outlasted generations, evolving with each new account while remaining rooted in the core elements that first made it compelling. The Jersey Devil is a reminder of the human fascination with the unknown, a symbol of the mysteries that still exist in a world often thought to be fully explored. It shows how folklore can capture the collective imagination, inspiring both fear and wonder. The search for the Jersey Devil is not merely about finding a physical creature. It's about exploring the human desire to uncover the unexplained, to connect with the past, and to find meaning in the natural world. Whether the Jersey Devil is real or a product of folklore may ultimately be less important than the legend's impact on the culture and identity of New Jersey. As long as there are stories to tell and mysteries to ponder, the Jersey Devil will remain a vital part of the state's folklore, casting its shadow over the Pine Barrens and inviting future generations to delve into its story. The legend, whether approached with belief or skepticism, teaches that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and that's where their magic lies. The Jersey Devil's tale has transcended its origins, becoming a legend that continues to fascinate, challenge, and inspire. Even as the world changes, the Pine Barrens will always be a place where one can hear whispers of something beyond understanding, where the Jersey Devil still roams in the imaginations of all who dare to wonder what might be lurking just out of sight. On a muggy Saturday night, June 7, 1986, 29-year-old Kathy Lipscomb parked her car in front of a modest apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas. As she reached into her purse to retrieve a tube of lipstick, she tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and studied her reflection. Her platinum bangs swept to the side of her forehead, and she noticed a glow that had not been there in a long time. It was a glimmer of something that had once been part of her life when she was a newlywed, before the years took their toll. Kathy's marriage had become a prison she was desperate to escape. 8 years and 2 children later, she had grown increasingly restless, feeling caged by the expectations and routines that had come to define her daily life. But that restlessness had taken on a new tone about a month ago, when she and her husband, Bill, had agreed to separate. The decision had been a difficult one, yet it offered her a taste of freedom she had craved. Now, for the first time in years, she felt like she was becoming herself again, a version of herself she had nearly forgotten existed. She stepped out of the car, clutching her purse close as she headed toward the building. The large apartment complex loomed ahead, casting shadows over the poorly lit parking lot. As she climbed the steps, Kathy could feel butterflies fluttering in her stomach, not the kind of nervousness that came with fear, but the kind that signaled anticipation, a thrill. She was heading to spend the night with her new boyfriend, a man she had fallen completely in love with. It was as if this relationship had breathed new life into her, rekindling a long-lost excitement. Bill, her soon-to-be ex-husband, had the kids for the weekend, giving Kathy a rare opportunity to let go of her worries and immerse herself in the present moment. She reached the 3rd floor and rang the doorbell of her boyfriend's apartment, a faint smile pulling at her lips as she listened to the sound of approaching footsteps. When the door opened, she stepped inside, her heart leaping as she was greeted by his warm embrace. The door closed behind them, sealing her away from the problems that had plagued her, if only for a little while. The next evening, Bill, a 30-year-old Air Force Master Sergeant, was driving the children to Kathy's new apartment on the other side of town. Kathy was supposed to pick them up from Bill's place, but she hadn't shown up, nor had she called. That was unusual for her. Kathy never neglected her responsibilities when it came to the kids, so when she didn't answer her phone either, Bill grew uneasy. It was almost 7 p.m. when they arrived at her building, And as Bill knocked on the door of Kathy's unit, a ground floor apartment, there was only silence in response. He tried knocking again, and again there was no answer. The kids stood next to him, looking up with curious, innocent faces, and Bill did his best to mask his concern. He didn't want to frighten them. Instead, he took a deep breath and told them to stay by the door while he went to get a notepad and pen from the car. He jotted down a quick note explaining that they had been there at 6:45 and would try again later, then taped it to the door. His daughter insisted on adding her own message. "Mommy, we love you," written in the blocky, uneven letters of a child. Bill smiled and stuck the note beside his own before turning back to the car with the children in tow. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kathy was known for her reliability, her steadfast commitment to routine. She was not the type to just vanish. Yet, here she was, unreachable and absent from the place she now called home. The uneasy feeling gnawed at him, growing stronger as the hours slipped by. The next morning, at 9 a.m. on Monday, Sarah Bowers, a colleague of Kathy's at the University Health Clinic, was walking briskly down the hallway to Kathy's office. Sarah needed to discuss an urgent matter with Kathy, but as she entered the room, she was met with emptiness. The "while you were out" memos had piled up on Kathy's desk, little pink slips stacking one on top of the other. Sarah glanced at them, her curiosity morphing into concern as she picked one up. It was from Bill, who had called an hour earlier looking for Kathy. Sarah's gut twisted. Kathy was not only a reliable nurse, but also her friend. She never missed work without giving a reason, and she always answered her phone. Sarah grabbed the phone on Kathy's desk and dialed Kathy's apartment number from memory. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. An unsettling anxiety settled over Sarah, and she found herself repeatedly glancing at the clock, each tick a reminder that something was off. By 10 a.m. Sarah could no longer stand it. She marched to their supervisor's office, her face tense with worry. Dr. David Pearl, their boss, looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing as Sarah explained Kathy's unexplained absence and Bill's unanswered calls. Dr. Pearl, although initially calm, began to share Sarah's concern. He agreed that something might be wrong and asked Sarah to drive over to Kathy's apartment to check on her. When Sarah arrived, she saw the notes Bill had taped to the door the previous evening, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. She knocked on the door, calling out Kathy's name, but there was no response. Desperate and driven by a growing sense of dread, she ran to find the building manager and pleaded for access to Kathy's apartment. Though the manager hesitated, knowing it was against policy to allow entry without the tenant's permission, she relented upon seeing the alarm in Sarah's eyes. The lock clicked open, and Sarah stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The apartment was neat and orderly, the way Kathy always kept it. Nothing appeared out of place, and yet it was painfully obvious that Kathy hadn't been home in some time. Around the same time, about 15 miles away, an airman driving to the local Air Force base noticed something lying in the grass along a quiet 2-lane road. As he drew closer, he realized that what he had seen wasn't discarded trash or debris, but something much worse. The airman pulled over, walked into the tall, unkempt grass, and stared in shock at what lay before him. It was a woman's body, contorted in a way that seemed unnatural, disturbing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he rushed back to his car and sped to the nearest house to call the police. Officers arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the silence of the desolate road. They moved toward the tall grass where the airman had found the body, their expressions hardening as they took in the sight. The young woman was unclothed, her skin pale under the morning sun, and there were faint trails of blood on the corners of her mouth. Her legs were bent, and her arms were arranged in a pose that struck the officers as deliberate, almost staged. It didn't look like a hasty act of disposal, but rather something far more sinister, a message left behind by the one who had taken her life. As investigators combed the scene for clues, Sergeant Marin of the Bexar County Sheriff's Office sat at his desk, reviewing the initial reports. The victim was believed to be a teenager at first glance, but something about the case felt off to Marin, even from the outset. As more details trickled in, the picture grew even murkier, and Kathy's unexplained absence took on a darker implication. Marin wasn't the only one beginning to suspect the worst. At the clinic, Sarah Bowers and Kathy's other colleagues shared the growing unease. The friendly banter that typically filled the air was replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances. The absence of their usually dependable coworker was more than an inconvenience. It was a shadow, growing longer by the hour, stretching toward a darkness none of them wanted to confront. In the days to come, the faint hope that Kathy would simply walk back through the clinic doors began to fade. The investigation was about to take a turn, one that would bring secrets to light and force those close to Kathy to question everything they thought they knew. When the initial description of the victim was released, it was believed she was a young girl, perhaps in her late teens, adding an extra layer of horror to the discovery. Sergeant Marin, a seasoned investigator, had seen many disturbing scenes in his career, but something about this one felt different. The way the body had been positioned, as if someone had carefully arranged her there, unsettled him. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Marin sat in his office, reviewing the photographs taken at the scene. The young woman's body lay in the grass, her legs bent awkwardly at the knee, ankles crossed, and her torso folded over her legs. There was a piece of cloth placed under her foot, her own clothes. It seemed rolled up rather than folded, suggesting a level of precision and intent. The positioning made it appear almost ritualistic, and Marin couldn't shake the feeling that whoever did this wanted the body to be found in exactly that manner. He wondered if the perpetrator had left other messages, ones that might not be immediately obvious. The autopsy report soon arrived, revealing more unsettling details. The victim had been subjected to an assault, and the cause of death was confirmed as strangulation. It likely occurred late on Sunday, a day before her body was found. There were 4 strands of long red hair recovered from the scene, placed carefully on the victim's body. But the victim herself was blonde, a detail that hinted at the possibility of a second person's involvement, or at least an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. As Marin combed through the crime scene report, his unease only deepened. He had seen instances where killers displayed their victims, but those cases were usually acts of rage, driven by personal connections. This felt cold, methodical, as if someone was toying with the investigation. The more he examined the case, the more convinced he became that they were dealing with someone who had planned this out, not an impulsive outburst of violence. The rolled-up clothing particularly caught his eye. It reminded him of military training, where soldiers are taught to roll clothes tightly for packing. Marin scribbled the word military in the margins of his notes, feeling a chill of recognition. The clues seemed to be pointing towards someone familiar with the Air Force. While Marin was piecing together his theories, another break in the case occurred. A friend of Kathy's contacted the medical examiner's office after seeing the description on the news. Despite the belief that the victim was a teenager, this friend couldn't shake the gut feeling that it was Kathy. The friend had gone to Kathy's apartment herself before calling the authorities, a fact that added another layer of confusion to the already complicated investigation. With Kathy's identity confirmed, Marin's focus shifted to retracing her last known movements. It became clear that Kathy's life had recently undergone dramatic changes, a pending divorce, a new relationship, and a new apartment in a neighborhood that some might call questionable. These details painted a picture of a woman trying to rebuild herself, perhaps even escaping something, but it didn't offer any answers about why she had met such a fate. If anything, it complicated the narrative. Marin wondered if Kathy's fresh start had somehow made her a target. Bill, Kathy's estranged husband, sat in a police interview room when Marin approached him with the grim news. Bill appeared composed, albeit pale, as Marin delivered his condolences and began asking questions. Bill's alibi seemed solid. He claimed he had been with their 2 young children all weekend. He was calm, maybe too calm, as he recounted how Kathy had moved into her new apartment only a week before. His disapproval of the area was evident, and he spoke about it with a hint of bitterness that Marin noticed. It wasn't uncommon for divorces to create animosity, and in cases like these, strained relationships often provided a motive. Yet, as Marin glanced over Bill, he saw no signs of a struggle, no visible injuries that might indicate a recent altercation. Marin asked if there was anyone in the Air Force who might have harbored a grudge against Bill or Kathy, but Bill flatly denied it. He insisted that his relationships at work were good and that Kathy had been well liked. As the interview drew to a close, Bill's frustration seemed to rise. He gritted his teeth when discussing Kathy's choice to live in what he considered a seedy area. It was clear that the separation was still fresh and painful for him, but if there was more beneath the surface, Bill wasn't showing it. The search for answers led Marin to Kathy's circle of friends and colleagues, who painted a more detailed picture of her life in the months leading up to her death. It was then that Marin learned about Kathy's new boyfriend, Dr. David Pearl. Kathy's friends were quick to share their skepticism about the relationship. The doctor was married, and rumors suggested he wasn't exactly faithful. He had a reputation as a charmer who kept a separate apartment for his rendezvous, away from the prying eyes of his wife. To many of Kathy's friends, this affair seemed reckless, especially with the divorce not yet finalized. Marin couldn't help but see this as a potential motive. Could Dr. Pearl have been trying to cover up an affair that went too far? Or was there something about the relationship that had pushed someone else to the edge? Dr. Pearl's demeanor when he came in for questioning didn't betray much. He appeared calm, polished even, as if unruffled by the entire situation. He expressed shock over Kathy's death, but offered little in the way of useful information. When Marin pressed him about his last meeting with Kathy, Dr. Pearl's demeanor shifted subtly, and he requested a lawyer. It was a move that Marin anticipated, yet it only deepened his suspicion. With Kathy's identity known and the investigation into her personal life in full swing, new details continued to emerge, further muddying the waters. One neighbor reported seeing a woman with long red hair lingering near Kathy's door on the same day her body was found. It was an odd coincidence, given the red hairs found at the crime scene, but without more information, Marin could only catalog it as another piece of the puzzle. The neighbor's description was vague, offering no solid leads to follow. Days turned into weeks, and despite Marin's best efforts, every promising lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. The red-haired woman remained unidentified. Dr. Pearl's lawyer kept him from saying anything incriminating, and Bill Lipscomb's alibi held up. Even the forensic evidence was limited, as Kathy's car, found a mile from her apartment, yielded no usable fingerprints. Whoever was responsible had been thorough, wiping away any trace of themselves. As weeks went by with no significant progress, Marin's frustration grew. Each dead end led him back to the beginning, forcing him to reconsider the clues as if he were missing something obvious. The media attention surrounding the case waned, and newer crimes took precedence over Kathy's. The weight of unsolved cases accumulated on Marin's desk, but the haunting image of Kathy's posed body lingered in his mind. He returned to her case file repeatedly, desperate to spot what he had overlooked. Yet, with each review, Marin could only confirm what he already knew. This was not a crime of passion, but of intention. Someone had gone to great lengths to mislead the investigation, to create a scene that spoke in riddles, But why? And for whom was the message intended? As the investigation stalled, Kathy's family struggled with the uncertainty, reaching out to Marin regularly for updates. There were no answers to offer them, only apologies and assurances that the case had not been forgotten. It wasn't until years later, when a private investigator was brought in by Kathy's mother, that a new light began to shine on the case. The investigator's discovery of Kathy's datebook provided Marin with his first solid lead in years, but it also brought new questions. What was the significance of the entries related to something called the WAPS test? It sounded like an exam of some sort, and as Marin's curiosity was piqued, the case seemed to shift once again, the scattered clues starting to form a clearer picture. As Marin examined the cryptic entries, he focused on one phrase that appeared multiple times: WAPS test. It wasn't clear what it meant, but a little digging revealed that WAPS stood for Weighted Airman Promotion System, a testing program used by the Air Force. Kathy had made several references to this test, and it appeared someone she knew had access to the answers. The possibility of cheating seemed far removed from the tragedy that had unfolded, but the details in the datebook couldn't be ignored. Marin's thoughts returned to Bill Lipscomb, Kathy's estranged husband and a career Air Force member. As he considered the possibility of a connection between the test entries and Bill, it occurred to Marin that Kathy might have known something that put her in danger. Perhaps there had been more than just marital strife pushing them apart. Marin decided it was time to revisit Bill's alibi and dig deeper into his life at the Air Force Base. When questioned again, Bill maintained his original story. He had been with the children all weekend, and they could confirm that. His tone was impatient, as though he felt persecuted, but Marin pressed on. He asked Bill about the WAPS test, and for a brief moment, Bill's demeanor shifted. It was a subtle change, a tightening around the eyes that Marin almost missed. Bill responded in a flat voice that the WAPS test was standard for promotions, and he didn't see how it had anything to do with Kathy's death. The conversation didn't yield much more, but the shift in Bill's expression lingered in Marin's mind. The investigator had a gut feeling that Bill wasn't telling the whole story. The datebook indicated Kathy had known something significant, and it was possible she had used that knowledge as leverage in the divorce. If so, Marin wondered, had that pressure escalated into something more dangerous? Meanwhile, Marin turned his attention back to Dr. David Pearl, Kathy's boyfriend. Despite his calm exterior during their first interview, Marin couldn't help but suspect that the doctor was hiding something. His refusal to speak without a lawyer had seemed too convenient, especially given the rumors about his reputation. When Marin went back through Kathy's datebook, he found more notes that mentioned David, but they didn't reveal much beyond what he already knew. There was nothing in the entries that directly tied Dr. Pearl to the WAPS test or any potential cheating scandal. Nonetheless, Marin arranged to bring Dr. Pearl in for a second round of questioning. This time, the doctor arrived with his liar in tow, clearly prepared to offer as little information as possible. Marin approached the interview from a different angle, asking Dr. Pearl if he had noticed any changes in Kathy's behavior leading up to her death. The doctor answered cautiously, saying that Kathy had seemed stressed about her separation from Bill, but hadn't mentioned anything unusual or threatening. Marin shifted gears, bringing up the datebook entries. He asked if Dr. Pearl had ever heard Kathy mention the WAPS test, or if she had discussed anything related to the Air Force. The doctor's lawyer intervened, advising him not to answer. The interview ended shortly thereafter, with Dr. Pearl's lawyer making it clear that their cooperation would not extend beyond what was legally required. Despite the lack of a breakthrough, Marin couldn't ignore the feeling that Dr. Pearl knew more than he was letting on. The doctor's relationship with Kathy, though seemingly unrelated to her murder, may have complicated her life in ways that extended beyond just romance. If Kathy had indeed uncovered something about the WAPS test, Dr. Pearl's awareness of it could be the missing link that tied together the scattered pieces of the case. As Marin continued to explore the theory of the cheating scandal, he interviewed several Air Force personnel who had worked with Bill. Most of them expressed shock and disbelief that a highly ranked sergeant like Bill could be involved in anything improper. One airman mentioned, however, that Bill had risen through the ranks unusually fast, securing promotions that seemed almost too good to be true. The comment was casual, made offhandedly, but it struck Marin as an important thread to follow. The possibility that Bill had obtained answers to the WAPS test could explain his rapid advancement, and if Kathy had threatened to expose him, it might also explain why she had been targeted. Marin sought access to the Air Force base records, hoping to find anything that might connect Bill to the cheating scandal. It was a difficult process, as military records are often guarded with strict confidentiality. But after persistent efforts, Marin was able to gain limited access. The records did indeed show that Bill had taken the WAPS test around the same time. Kathy's datebook suggested someone had access to the answers. Although there was no direct evidence linking Bill to cheating, the timing was suspicious. Marin was beginning to see a pattern that was hard to dismiss. If Kathy had discovered that Bill was cheating on the test, she could have used it as leverage during the divorce, a threat that Bill might not have taken lightly. Still, the lack of physical evidence tying Bill or Dr. Pearl directly to the crime scene left Marin frustrated. He couldn't charge anyone based on theories alone, and both men maintained plausible deniability. Then there was the matter of the red hair found on Kathy's body, a detail that hadn't led to any solid leads. The mysterious red-haired woman reported by the neighbor hadn't resurfaced, and Marin was left wondering if she had simply been a distraction, an intentional misdirection set up by the killer. It was around this time that the private investigator hired by Kathy's family uncovered a crucial piece of information that had been overlooked. Kathy's daughter had something to say. The young girl, now a little older and able to articulate more clearly, revealed a detail that no one had known before. She admitted that on the night Kathy had disappeared, she and her brother had not actually been with their father as they had originally said. Instead, they had been with one of Bill's friends, a man named Clint Richards. The revelation hit Marin like a jolt. Clint Richards was a familiar name. He had been one of the airmen questioned early in the investigation, but at the time, he had seemed of little consequence. Now, with this new information, Marin saw the situation in a different light. If Clint had taken the children while Bill was free to act, it could mean that Bill had orchestrated the entire scenario, using Clint to establish a false alibi. Marin immediately brought Clint back in for questioning. Unlike their previous encounter, this time Clint seemed nervous. As Marin pressed him about the night in question, Clint's responses grew hesitant, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. He stuck to his story, insisting he had simply watched the kids while Bill handled some personal matters. But when Marin asked him directly if he had been involved in transporting Kathy's body or tampering with the crime scene, Clint's composure cracked. Under the weight of the interrogation, Clint confessed that he had indeed helped Bill on the night Kathy died. He claimed he didn't know what Bill had planned and had been shocked when Bill revealed Kathy's body. According to Clint, Bill had instructed him to assist in staging the scene to make it look like a random, gruesome crime. The red hairs, the positioning of the body, it had all been part of Bill's twisted plan to mislead investigators and buy himself time. With Clint's confession, Marin finally had the break he needed. The pieces were falling into place, but questions still remained. Why had Bill gone to such elaborate lengths to cover up his tracks? And what role, if any, had the WAPS test played in Kathy's fate? Marin felt closer to answers than ever, yet he knew there was still more to uncover before the whole truth could come to light. Clint had helped Bill transport Kathy's body from the apartment, and then the two men had staged the scene on that lonely road. Every detail had been designed to throw off investigators. the unnatural positioning of her body, the rolled-up clothes under her foot, and the carefully placed strands of red hair. Clint's account painted a picture of Bill as a calculating and desperate man, willing to manipulate those around him to protect himself. When pressed for more details, Clint claimed he hadn't known Kathy was dead until it was too late. Bill had already hidden her body in a chest by the time Clint arrived, and he had made it clear that Clint's job was to assist in moving it, no questions asked. Clint said he had felt trapped, unable to refuse. Marin had his doubts about Clint's level of involvement, but for now, the confession gave him enough leverage to go after Bill with renewed vigor. As Marin pushed forward, he continued to probe into the WAPS test angle. Clint's confession had established Bill's motive as one of self-preservation, but Marin needed to confirm whether the cheating scandal had been the catalyst for Kathy's murder. He reached out to other Air Force personnel who had taken the test around the same time. Some mentioned hearing rumors about answers circulating before the exam, but no one admitted to any direct knowledge. Still, the rumor mill suggested that cheating was more widespread than the Air Force was willing to acknowledge. The breakthrough came when Marin stumbled upon a retired airman who had once been close to Bill. The man, a former colleague named Gary Maddox, reluctantly agreed to talk. Over a cup of coffee, Gary explained that back when Bill was taking the WAPS test, there had been a lot of pressure to advance quickly. Promotion opportunities were scarce, and the competition was fierce. For some, cutting corners was an unspoken secret. When Marin asked him if he believed Bill had cheated, Gary hesitated. "All I'll say is Bill always seemed to know things that he shouldn't have," he muttered, stirring his coffee. Gary's words were vague, but they hinted at something deeper, a network of individuals who had shared the answers to the test, a secret that had remained buried within the ranks. If Kathy had indeed discovered this network and threatened to expose it during the divorce, it could have motivated Bill to silence her. As Marin began to connect the dots, he saw a disturbing pattern emerge. The red hairs, the military-style precision in the staging of the scene, and Clint's involvement all suggested that Kathy's murder had been more than just an act of rage. It had been a calculated decision to protect a career and cover up a scandal that could have ruined multiple lives. With Clint's cooperation, Marin secured a warrant to search Bill's property. There, in the attic, he found documents related to the WAPS test, including a handwritten note containing what appeared to be answers to some of the exam questions. This evidence was the smoking gun Marin had been searching for. It connected Bill to the cheating scheme, reinforcing the theory that Kathy's knowledge of his illicit activities was what sealed her fate. Marin felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together. As Bill was brought in for questioning, his demeanor remained unflinching. He still presented himself as the respectable Air Force sergeant, and his calmness bordered on arrogance. But as Marin laid out the evidence, Clint's confession, the recovered documents, and Gary's statements, Bill's expression hardened. It was as though the facade he had carefully constructed began to crack. Marin could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, but Bill remained tight-lipped. In the days that followed, Clint's confession allowed Marin to reconstruct the events leading up to Kathy's death with greater accuracy. Bill had manipulated Kathy's trust, luring her to his apartment that fateful night under the pretense of discussing arrangements for the children. When Kathy arrived, the atmosphere quickly shifted. She had sensed something was wrong, but Bill had been prepared. He overpowered her, using an electrical cord he had placed nearby, knowing it would be there when he needed it. Clint was called in later, not as a participant in the actual crime, but as a complicit accessory in the disposal and staging of the body. The arrangement of Kathy's body on that remote road was a carefully orchestrated deception, meant to suggest a disturbed stranger had been responsible. The inclusion of the red hairs, taken from a wig Bill had in his possession, was intended to throw off the investigation entirely. But while Bill had gone to great lengths to divert attention, his elaborate measures had ultimately been his undoing. The more complex the cover-up, the more threads there were to unravel, and Marin had found just enough to pull the entire scheme apart. The revelation of Kathy's murder being tied to the VUAPS test scandal shook the Air Force community. For many, it was a rude awakening to the length some individuals would go to protect their careers and reputations. Marin could feel the weight of the case lifting, but there was one final piece that still troubled him: Kathy's children. They had been unwitting participants in their father's lies, instructed to tell a story that wasn't true, shielding him from suspicion. It was a cruel manipulation that had kept them in the dark about their mother's fate. Marin visited the Lipscomb children one last time, this time accompanied by a family liaison to help them process what had happened. Now older, Kathy's daughter finally spoke with a clarity that had eluded her years earlier. She recalled the small but significant details that had lingered in her memory: the odd hush around her father's apartment that night, the absence of her mother's voice. She had always known something was wrong, but had been too young to fully understand. As the truth came to light, Marin could see a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her face, as though she had finally been freed from a lie she had carried without knowing. Bill Lipscomb was charged with Kathy's murder, and as the case went to trial, the full story emerged in the courtroom. Clint testified, his voice wavering as he recounted the night he helped Bill dispose of Kathy's body. The evidence of the cheating scheme and Bill's desperate measures to protect himself sealed the case for the prosecution. It wasn't just about one man's actions, but about a system that allowed secrets to fester in dark, decisions to be made in the name of ambition. As Marin watched Bill being led away in handcuffs, there was no sense of triumph, only a bittersweet feeling of closure. The case had haunted him for years, and while justice had finally been served, it had come at a steep cost. The truth was out, but Kathy's life was gone forever, leaving behind a broken family and memories that would never heal completely. For Kathy's family, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring her back. He had solved the case, uncovered the truth about Kathy's death, but he couldn't help wondering if it had all come a little too late. The military was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture of silence and complicity that had allowed unethical practices to go unchecked. Promotions were scrutinized, and the ripple effect of the scandal reached far beyond Bill's actions, affecting careers and lives in ways that could never be fully measured. He avoided prison time by agreeing to a plea deal that required him to testify in detail about his role in Kathy's death and the cover-up. Clint's confession painted him as a reluctant accomplice, but many questioned just how much he knew and whether he had truly been as unaware as he claimed. He had played his part in Bill's plan, and while he might have escaped the full consequences of the law, the weight of his choices would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a burden no child should ever have to carry, and despite the support from extended family and counselors, there were wounds that would take a lifetime to heal. Kathy's daughter, now old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened, carried a quiet anger. It wasn't just for the loss of her mother, but for the years spent in confusion, unknowingly protecting a lie. He knew that for Kathy's mother, the grief had taken a toll that words could never fully capture. The older woman had fought relentlessly for answers, never accepting that the case would grow cold. It was her determination that had led to the involvement of the private investigator and, ultimately, the breakthrough in the investigation. Though the truth was finally out, it was a harsh comfort, one that brought a kind of closure that was still wrapped in sorrow. It was a reminder of the darkness that people are capable of when driven by desperation and fear. He had seen the worst that ambition could breed, how it could corrupt, consume, and destroy lives. The revelation of Bill's cheating and his willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect. His secret had shown just how deep that darkness could run. He was determined to get out of prison earlier than expected, despite the severity of his crime. The thought made Marin's blood simmer, but he knew that the justice system would take its course. Bill had spent years manipulating others, using deception as his shield, and while it was possible he might find some technicality to exploit, the full truth of what he had done would never be erased. There was no escaping the fact that he had taken a life and shattered a family. Whether or not he truly regretted his actions was something only Bill himself knew, but his release sparked outrage among those who had followed the case. For Kathy's family, it was like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. The outrage was understandable. There had been a promise of justice, a sense that Bill would face the full consequences of his choices. Yet here he was, walking free after just a few short years. But even in her weakened state, she refused to stay silent. She spoke out against the decision, calling it an insult to her daughter's memory and a betrayal of justice. Her voice trembled, but there was a fire in her words that showed she would not give up, even now. Marin, though no longer directly involved, kept an eye on Bill, expecting that the man might slip back into his old ways. There were rumors that Bill had reconnected with some old military contacts, but nothing concrete emerged. It was as if he had managed to slip back into the shadows, hoping to disappear from public scrutiny. Yet, Marin knew that some stains could never be washed away. It had been a long journey, full of twists and turns, with moments of despair and triumph. But the conclusion left a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that Kathy's story had not been fully told. There were still unanswered questions about the extent of the WPS test scandal, about who else might have known what Bill had done, and about the forces that allowed him to manipulate the system so effectively. The haunting memory of Kathy's story served as a stark reminder that justice, though pursued with the best intentions, was not always as definitive as it seemed. The darkness that had surrounded her death was a part of life he had learned to accept, but it was one he would never be comfortable with. As the years went on, Kathy's case became a ghost that followed him, a story he would tell younger detectives, not just to share his experience, but as a warning about the lengths people will go to bury the truth and the need for perseverance in uncovering it.